So this is just a couple of days before National Good Neighbor Day, which is September 28th. And I'm looking around, most of you are from Missouri. And, in Missouri, it's Missouri Good Neighbor Week, September 28th to October 4th. And so really want to encourage you to take some action during that week. Visit the website and report what you've done to connect with neighbors during Missouri Good Neighbor Week. And if you have time, nominate someone as Missouri's most engaged neighbor. Everyone who is nominated is going to get an acknowledgement gift and an acknowledgement letter. So they will know that someone appreciated their efforts enough to nominate them. And then 10 people around the state will be selected by judges for a little higher level of recognition. But even a nomination of someone is a nice way to let them know that what they're doing in the community or in their neighborhood is appreciated. So encourage you to do that if you're in Missouri or Pennsylvania, like Jesslyn. You'll have to come up with your own situation there in Pennsylvania, or just take advantage of what's in place for National Good Neighbor Day. So just that's a reminder. Then today, of course, welcome. This is a bonus edition of Neighboring 101. This is one way to kind of celebrate Missouri Good Neighbor Week. And so technically it's our 34th session of Neighboring 101. And this is where we have different guests and authors on from around the country that are working in this neighboring space. And we do this as both an encouragement to you, but also an idea generator for many people on different approaches they can take, whether it's asset-based community development or other approaches to improve their community and neighborhood. So thank you for being here and delving more deeply into this topic of neighboring. If you are in Neighboring 101, which I believe all of you are, it looks like, you can access past classes from the links that are sent out in our email. They are sent out unlisted, so you have to check that email to find those past videos and classes. And one further reminder, we do have one other bonus session, pardon me, and that is at 10 a.m. on October 3rd. That's at the very end of Missouri Good Neighbor Week, and we'll be interviewing Dr. Seth Kaplan about his new book that's coming out called Fragile Neighborhoods. And I'll just give a shout out to Eric Smith, who's on here. If you can't make that session on October 3rd with Steph Kaplan, Eric is hosting one on October 4th with Seth Kaplan. Eric, you're free to drop a link in the chat or something if you'd like for people to know about that one, if they'd rather, if their calendar, allows them to attend that one instead. So Seth Kaplan, author of Fragile Neighborhoods, which is just coming out in October. But today, that's a short introduction of some of the things we have coming on. Today, our interest is turned toward another book, and that is this one, Start with Hello. What a great title to begin with. And not only is it easy to remember, but it kind of captures the whole idea, really. And Shannan Martin is our guest today. I'll drop a link in the chat to her page about her other books that she's written as well. A 3-time author, I believe. And she's a wife and a neighbor living in Goshen, Indiana. She's a avid reader. She says she's a wannabe-gardener and a news geek. That sounds like quite a combination. And a thrift store stalker and a justice fighter, and apparently an aficionado of not too spicy salsa. Now, I don't know how I feel about that. Spicy and salsa, those should be used together in my book. So
not too spicy.
Not too spicy. So we may have to explore that one further there, Shannan. She is, of course, the author of our book, Start with Hello, A Ministry of Ordinary Places is a second book, and Falling Free. And she's also a cook at a local nonprofit dedicated to feeding her community. And because of that, she often falls asleep at night thinking about breakfast. I love that. And I love that she serves her neighborhood and community so regularly. Shannan, thank you for joining us from Indiana today.
It's my pleasure. It's very good to be here representing the Hoosier State. Yeah, it looks like most of us are Midwestern at a minimum. So yeah, that makes us neighbors. I feel like anytime anytime we're crossing paths or rubbing shoulders, we are officially neighbors. So hi, neighbor.
Well, since you mentioned Hoosiers, I feel like we should take a halftime break in this and then have a really inspirational, moving speech from you
All
that makes us
right.
want to go
Go
out and
play
do
some
even more
hoops.
neighboring. Go
Yeah.
play some hoops. Yeah. Well, I happened upon your book. Gosh, I don't know. It's been probably at least a year ago now. I read through it once and marked it up with some notes and just thought there was a lot in there to digest and think about on this subject. And before we maybe delve into some of those questions, and of course the floor is open for everybody on this Zoom
Mhm.
to ask questions, maybe just kind of give you a bit of an opportunity about how you ended up navigating toward this topic
Yeah.
and writing a book like this.
Yeah, I'd love to. So my family, we let me start by saying I am a wife. My husband Corey is the chaplain of the county jail here in Elkhart County, Indiana. So we're way up by the Michigan line, a couple hours east of Chicago. We have 4 children. Our oldest is grown and out on his own in a nearby city. And then we have one who we just sent off to college in the fall for the first time.
Oh,
I know, it was a big step. He's at Purdue. And then we have 2 in high school. So my family moved to this neighborhood, this home that we're in right now, 12 years ago. And we moved from just a very different social location. So we did not move far. We moved maybe 20 minutes up the road. But we had previously lived in a very rural, we lived out in the country, and what we said was our dream farmhouse. We thought we would stay there forever, raise these babies. We had both been raised kind of out in the country. And that was the plan that we thought was, the ideal for our family. Um, all of our kids came to our family through adoption. So that's something a bit unique about our family. But we were surprised when we pretty quickly made a pivot into, and I'm really kind of boiling this down really quickly. We're at a high boil here. um, because there's just a lot that happened during that time, a lot of things that sort of captured our attention and captured our curiosity that led to us putting that farmhouse in a very insular and a very homogenous community. We put that farm on the market and we ended up moving into our neighborhood here in Goshen with 3 tiny little kids. We had a preschooler, a kindergartner, and a second grader. Our 4th kiddo, who is also our oldest, had not joined our family yet at that point. But when we moved into this neighborhood, everything was new to me. I had never lived, honestly, in a situation where I even had a lot of close proximity neighbors. I had always kind of lived in more rural places. And we found ourselves not only for the first time really engaging with people as neighbors on a regular basis, but we also landed in a very diverse in every sense of the word neighborhood. So from race, ethnicity, religion, political belief, socioeconomic status. I mean, all the way across the board, we were sort of inserted into a place with a lot of difference, and we were very excited about that. We honestly moved into this place because we suddenly realized that maybe we were just simply missing out on some important facets of life by living in places where we had always been surrounded by people who looked and lived and believed as we did. And so we went honestly looking for some difference, and we found it here. But at the point that we landed here, amid all the change and transition and excitement, I started to really grapple with the question of, okay, so what do I do? What does this look like? How do we connect? We were here because we wanted to connect with other people, and yet I just had never been taught really how to do that. And so that launched me into my more formal public writing. I had been a blogger for 10 years prior to that point, but I had not published a book. And so I ended up writing that first book, Falling Free, and then The Ministry of Ordinary Places. And they were both books that took more of a faith-based approach on the ideas of community and, what's the big deal here? Why are we to care for our neighbors, and what does that look like? With my third book, I knew I wanted to pull back from some of that and give a more, a higher view on the question that I kept getting, no matter, I had written 2 books on the topic. I write in a very story-based style, but I had written these 2 books about kind of how to do this, I thought, and yet no matter where I went to speak, people would come up to me afterwards and say, I really loved your book, but how do I do it? And I
Mm.
was always here like, I feel like I've tried to answer that question, but I realized I just was not specific enough. I had not made it simple enough. And so I knew that that was going to have to be, and I really wanted it to be, that 3rd book that became Start with Hello, that was written as really a field guide, no matter where you live. And most of us don't live in a neighborhood like I do. And we live in all different kinds of locations. And I wanted it to be a book that anybody from any place, regardless of their faith or their politics or, their lens on the world, could pick this book up and walk away with some really simple steps towards the people near them. And so that's, I did the thing that people say authors should do. And I wrote the book that I wish somebody would have put in my hands 12 years ago when I was just starting out into this way of living as a neighbor.
That's a great way to describe it. Wow, there was a lot in there to unpack. May have to play the recording back to remember the questions that came up in my mind. But I do remember you used the word taught,
Mhm.
that no one had taught you how to be a neighbor. And why that catches my attention is sometimes with some of my programs, I will have people say, "You mean we have to teach people how to be neighbors now?"
Mhm.
Like it's a bad thing.
Yeah.
Usually if you explore that conversation further with those people, you realize they don't actually know their neighbors' names either, but that's another matter. Um, but you said taught specifically, so this is something that's modeled or something that can be taught and improved upon.
Absolutely. I think in most areas of our life, even as I think of, raising teenagers and launching young adults into the world, we understand the necessity of teaching certain skills to our youth. We understand that there are many things that we have been taught or still wish that we could learn. And yet, when it comes to community, there's this idea that it should just come very naturally. And to your point, David, about the person or the people who might say, wait, we have to teach this, acting like, oh, we've just gotten so far away from the way things used to be or whatever.
Yeah.
I think it's a little easier in some ways to take that approach when we immerse ourselves in a world of similarity. And I wonder if sometimes people who tend to see it as overly simplified have just not found their way into tension or complexity in the way that honestly the world invites us to do. I think of the ways my life has become richer as I have been more intentional with just kind of seeking out that tension and that discomfort in a lot of ways. But I do think there's this idea that, it's sort of like an old-timey idea. We think of back in the day or whatever, when it may have seemed like it was a little bit easier, and the world continues to turn and our culture continues to shift. And yet I believe with my whole heart that this is something for us, and it's for right now. This is something we can get back to, but somebody has to kind of take us by the hand and say, number one, this is why this matters. This is how your life will be made better. And number two, this is what it looks like to take those steps to learn how to do it. Because it's not something, my intention in writing this book is not that somebody would read the book and say to themselves, okay, I'm going to change my entire life. I'm going to read this book and then I'm going to suddenly know how to live as a neighbor. My hope is that people would read this book and identify one area in their life where they might say, oh, this is something that I could start doing today. This is just a new little intention that I could carry away from this today. And so it's written in those like really small baby steps, because we can't eat it all at once. We can't do it all at once, but we can just take that one next little step. And just like we have in the chat, that simple hello, that hi, that wave, it feels sometimes like that's not enough. It feels too small, but I have learned over and over again that the small things are really the only things because they just lead to a next small thing. And before you know it, you have a community surrounding you where you can look out and feel like you belong. You can know your neighbors' faces and names and know that they know yours. And you can really start to believe that when you need something, there are people near you who know you and have your back. And if we can get to that place slowly over time, that's what creates this good life that we're looking for.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. It does take time, doesn't it? But
It
I love
does.
the fact that you use the word simple a lot, both
Yeah.
in your subtitle, simple ways to live as a neighbor, and then at the end of every chapter, you have one simple way.
Hmm.
And I love that feature because it's sort of practical tools or practical ideas
Hmm.
that you can undertake. Because I think sometimes people hear that getting to know your neighbors, and even if it's starting with hello, they either seem to be at a loss of what else to do, or they
Yeah.
think that means they have to host a block party for 100 neighbors.
Right.
There doesn't seem to be any middle ground. But I think in your book, you're really saying these are simple steps that kind of
Hmm.
just incorporate those that live around you in your normal routine of life in lots of
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah. I think, we all live wherever we happen to live, some by choice. Some of us don't get to choose where we live. Regardless, most of us live where we live without knowing in some kind of a meaningful way the people who are closest to us. And so, we choose a place or we make a place our home, and yet we exist kind of in this weird sense of isolation, where we most of us feel kind of disconnected from the immediate world that we're in. We don't necessarily feel a strong sense of belonging or purpose where we live. And I just think it's not as difficult to get there as we might feel that it is. I think it feels a little awkward. I write a good bit and start with hello about the idea of awkwardness and embracing a little bit of awkwardness, a little bit of discomfort. That's what is really required to get us to where we want to be. I wish I could solve awkwardness and I can't. I feel awkward plenty still after 12 years. I mean, there's still plenty of people I don't know. There are still plenty of situations where I walk away and feel like, I'm just the most awkward person in the world. But I've learned that we all kind of feel that way about ourselves. And so if we can just kind of go first, if we can kind of be the ones to lead with a little bit of that awkwardness, knowing that we can survive it, and knowing one of the things that's been helpful for me as I've tried to train myself to embrace some of that awkwardness is putting myself on the other side of the equation. Anytime I meet somebody new and it feels a little clunky, or maybe, I can tell that other person is kind of nervous, or maybe they've just put themselves out there in a way, they've shown up at my door with cookies or, whatever the case may be, or just, made that kind of stumbling, awkward conversation out on the sidewalk. I only ever feel disarmed by that. I feel like it's approachable. I feel like, okay, we're not doing perfect here. We haven't set the bar at everything's got to be perfect and scripted and ideal. When I'm on the other side of those moments, I always feel an invitation to just be myself. And so if we can begin to kind of lead with that and know that it's going to give us some of those emotions and we can push through them, and when we do, what's waiting for us on the other side is connection. I think that's a really good place to start.
Connection's the goal, right?
Yeah.
It's I think I saw somewhere where you had phrased some of that as like an open door, not a perfect
Yeah.
door. Maybe
Yes.
it's not Martha Stewart and seven course meal, right? Um,
Thank God. I mean,
yeah,
that's how a lot of us feel when especially when I wrote about and we think about the idea of having people into our homes, which that's not like a day one decision. Okay. So if some of us are feeling like, okay, I want to start to get to know my neighbors, most of us who come to that understanding aren't going to start with, I'm going to host a dinner party. Some of us might, and I think that's great. But even as we get to that point and we start to understand, like, it's important to share space, and there's a certain level of vulnerability that we get to when we invite people into our space, or when we are vulnerable enough to go into somebody else's space. Many of us have been trained to think that the goal is the house is going to look spotless, the kids are going to behave perfectly, which never happens. The meal is going to be made from scratch and it's going to be delicious, and there's going to be this playlist that I've curated playing softly, and there might be candles, and we have all these ideas that we've picked up through magazines or movies or social media or whatever. If that's the goal, I am never going to do it. I will never do it. I might think that it sounds fun, I might think that I can do it, but ultimately most of our lives don't allow that. I mean, not only is that a lot of work, it's also financially not feasible for a lot of us. I mean, we have budget constraints, we have uncooperative kids, we have our own introversion to deal with, we have messy homes because wherever we are, we live there. Life is messy. So beginning to kind of break down some of those barriers and just set the bar as low as it needs to be in order for us to take that action.
Yeah. I know my wife is really going to appreciate me telling this story on her. Sometimes hosting, it's just, I've heard her say, wow, I don't think I have time to clean the house and everything before they come visit. And I had heard someone say before, don't clean the house before the neighbors come visit, clean it afterwards, right after they've come and made a mess or dropped food or whatever. And I've mentioned that to her, and I know she looks at me like I'm a unicorn and have that idea. She just cannot believe that. But that's really what you're saying. Invite people into your life and your normal routine, and the big cleanup really can happen after
Yeah.
the neighbors have left.
I think most of us have probably been invited into somebody else's home or space, and it has been imperfect.
Mm.
And I know that when I'm that person, and I can tell you almost everything I know about this topic, I have learned secondhand from my neighbors. So I'll just say, there have been times I've been invited into the homes of my neighbors, and I walk in and find a very lived-in home. It is not perfect. It is just, it's life. And I always breathe a little easier. I always feel pretty honored that I was trusted to just come in, welcome in. This is us. This is how we live. This is real life. It feels like a real honor when somebody invites me into just their everyday life. And so if I can hold that in memory and just get a little better, I don't want to be the kind of person, and I have been this person before, where somebody knocks on my door and I look around and it feels chaotic in here. And so I just scoot myself onto the porch and try to have the conversation there, because I'm afraid of being judged. I'm afraid of, somebody kind of giving the side eye to the way I live. I want to be the type of person who just flings that door open and says, come on in. Doesn't make excuses for it. Just, this is life. Life is messy. People are messy. We all know this because we all know how we are living behind closed doors. If we can kind of get a little more comfortable with living that way with the door wide open, welcoming people in to whatever happens to be going on, that brings us closer to those authentic connections that just make life feel more connected and make life feel better.
Yeah.
I wrote a whole chapter on this idea, and I did, to be fair. I mean, if I have a little bit of heads up, there are things I'm going to do, right? Like there are things I'm going to sweep the piles of junk off of the island. There are a couple quick things, like if I've got 5 minutes, what am I going to do? And so I wrote that in the book because I want to be as real as I can. And the reality is I would like to give a quick moment of attention to my bathroom if I know somebody is coming over. And yet, so I kind of listed when I have 5 or 10 minutes, this is what I do. And part of that meant throwing a bunch of junk into a bedroom and closing the door. This is real stuff. However, when we don't have advance notice, because I think a lot of the good stuff happens kind of on the fly, I don't want to be somebody who misses out on that interaction just because I'm afraid. And so learning to be a little less afraid it's kind of opened my world in a really fun and healthy way. You're muted, David.
Golly, uh, coughing is why I was muted. That approach is part of what makes this simple. I mean, we've probably all read articles about etiquette, and I know I did recently about etiquette for a dinner party at your house. By the time I got done with the article, I was exhausted.
Right.
I thought, my lands, how could I ever do that?
Yep.
So a simple approach, a much more manageable approach, and probably more sustainable.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
more real and authentic. I think you used that word as well. I see a few comments popping up in chat, but folks, you're always welcome to take yourself off mute and ask a question. Would encourage you to do that even. Mark Applegate's asking if it ever has been okay not to have everything in our world spotless. It is 2023. Authenticity is in.
That's true. It's true.
And Jessa mentions that she really enjoyed the chapter all about cleaning up. Yeah, wiping things off and just getting it ready for someone. So obviously people can relate to that whole idea.
One of the chapter that kind of followed that up, I talk about just like feeding people. And that's a big part of my life. It's what I do for my vocation, and it's a role I fulfill here in my own home with my family. But it's another thing that can feel intimidating, to think of. I mean, we have dietary restrictions. We have foods we don't like. We have the time and the money and the effort that it takes to do these things. And so I wrote about the foundation that I got in this area in my own childhood years when my parents had a group of, close friends that we spent a lot of time with at that phase in life. And they would often just put out a call on the landline, because that's all we had back then, like with the long twirly cord, and just say, hey, do you want to just come over and bring whatever you have? And so it turned into, it was always just a hodgepodge of, food that didn't necessarily work together, and yet it totally worked together. And we've started to kind of carry that into areas of our lives. If we think of having a small group that's meeting, there are people who are much more organized. I'm not like a super type A person in that way. So I know some of this is just personality, and some people really enjoy, sending out the sign up list and, making sure there's a well-rounded meal that's going to happen. That's not me. And that's not how I roll. So we've started to just approach those types of situations with just bring something if you can. And, sometimes people, for whatever reason, there have been times we didn't bring anything. It's like, bring something if you can, or just show up. And so you end up with just the most random selection of food, and you sit together and you eat together. And it's fun. It's kind of interesting to see what happens, but above everything else, it's just real. It's just real life. So that's what I'm interested in, is taking the idea of connection and living together as neighbors. That subtitle, Simple Ways to Live as Neighbors, that was very intentionally worded, because it's not so much about being a good neighbor as it is learning to live as neighbors together, kind of in this sort of give and take and push and pull. And it's not just one person neighboring somebody. It's this idea of living together in peace when possible. But yeah, finding ways to just pull that out of this abstract realm and bring it down to street level, where we're actually living, where life is very full and often chaotic, and still there are ways to make those connections.
You keep saying connections. That is such a key, isn't it? Go ahead. I hear somebody else getting ready to talk.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much. First of all, here to potluck dinners. It's magical. Don't tell me what you're bringing. If I'm really lucky, I'll get 4 chocolate cakes.
Exactly.
4 or 5 kinds of meatballs. And that's part of the connection, is discussing, what you decide you should bring and everything. This is such an important topic. I wanted to ask, you shared that you relocated about a dozen years ago. A 2-part, if I may. How did you first start what did you find were some of your successes when you were trying to connect with your neighbors?
Mhm.
And tying that to today, social media, there's such a wide range of how we connect or don't connect, Facebook groups, Messenger, Instagram, and everybody's got a
Mhm.
little bit different things. So how do you find to navigate that when you're building connections in a community?
Yeah, those are great questions. Thank you for those, Kate. I would say early on, we found the most success, and success is even kind of a loaded word to use for that because it feels, I remember it feeling for a very long time like nothing was happening. You know, like, does this count? Okay, I've said hi to this neighbor morning after morning as we walk to school. Does that count? And so I want to remind us it does, it all counts. It is all working towards the ultimate goal, and it's okay if it feels really slow. I think that slow movement towards each other is often more sustainable and enduring. And it just kind of reorients us into a different posture of how we want to be, how we want to live in the world. And for us, that means we wave to everybody, we say hi to everybody. We've just learned to do that. But the things that worked, I guess, the things that actually brought us connection early on when we didn't know anybody was to just join in, to find things that were already happening around us and be very quick to say yes and very quick to jump in. So for me, that meant joining the PTO at the elementary school where my kids all attended, just a block and a half up the street here. That was a place where something was already happening. And I didn't have to lead it. And honestly, nobody wanted me to lead it, but I could just show up and I could just be myself and bring the gifts that I have and add it to the gifts that were already there and just work together towards a shared goal and towards a common good. We learned to just say yes. You know, if we were invited to do something, we were, if at all possible, we were going to say yes. We were going to be there and do it. And then the other thing was just taking a lot of walks, just learning to, and that sounds silly to say, but I really had to learn how to take walks in my neighborhood because I had never lived in a neighborhood where that was even possible. So in my second book, The Ministry of Ordinary Places, I wrote about how this is kind of embarrassing for me, but I've already said the school is a block and a half up the street. For the first year or so that we lived here, I drove my kids to school. It's so very close. And I was loading these like wild little kids into the minivan and buckling them into booster seats and doing all this stuff just to get them up the street. And at some point, you know, it's like it dawns on me, oh, most of my neighbors are just walking. That might be a good way to meet the people that I'd like to meet, to travel in the way that they are traveling. And so I made that commitment to, we're going to walk to school every single day, no matter the weather, just like my neighbors do. And it was a huge game changer. And I don't know why it took me a while to understand that, other than to just say, it's just what I had always done. And so sometimes we have to kind of retrain ourselves, even in these really basic patterns that we have established, and just try something new. And that practice, and I would say, you know, it is a practice. And for me, it was even like a spiritual practice of taking that short walk to and from school every morning, because it started to teach me the value of paying attention to my place, noticing the world that I'm in, noticing the creative world, you know, the physical world, the sky and the trees and those things, but also it just started to give me a better sense of where I was and who was around me and what are the rhythms of my place. And so it's something that has stayed with me forever. And so I highly recommend it. I think learning to be attentive people is just really key in this whole endeavor of connecting with each other, because it's not so much always about going out and trying to make connection happen, but it's learning to live in such a way that when opportunities pop up around us, we notice them and we are ready to say yes. So that's the first part of your question. To transfer that over to the online world, I mean, you know, I have my work at the community kitchen, and then I also have this other part of my work week where I'm sitting here in my house and I'm writing and I'm doing those authory kind of things. And a lot of that work happens in online spaces. And I really think it's possible to create authentic connection and to lead with authenticity in those spaces. And that's important to me. I try to post selfies regularly because I think it helps us to see the person that we are kind of talking to online. But more importantly, I try to post selfies that are not especially ideal of myself, because you're seeing me right now, like I did my hair, I put on some makeup. This isn't really actually how I live most of my life. Most of my life, I have my ball cap on. I am looking kind of affright. And that's how most of my neighbors generally see me and engage with me and recognize me. And so, to be fair, if I want to lead with authenticity, it's really important for me to show that more regular version of myself in online spaces. I just think anytime we can lead with authenticity, it helps. I work really hard. Instagram is probably the main place that in terms of social media, where I connect. I try to make it a place where conversation happens and where differences of opinion can be heard. We have ground rules and all those things to keep the community safe, but I really enjoy hearing from people and I enjoy being part of conversation. I enjoy even disagreeing about certain things. And so that's kind of how I've chosen to handle social media. And the last thing I would say is, you probably notice if you spend time in online spaces, you're hearing more and more about like, join my email list, follow my Substack. We're all kind of doing that because it's giving us the sense of connection, even in our work life, that we're looking for. It's allowing us to like whittle that audience down and have really real conversations with people. And so, finding my way into some of that has been a really useful tool, but also it's just been good for my soul as I continue doing this work.
Well, I'm going to have to quote you when I show up at work in running shorts and a t-shirt. Say I'm just showing up as my authentic self.
I think that would be awesome.
You have just given me permission to do that. So
Yep.
That's what I heard.
Yep. You got it.
Well, kind of along those lines of listening to your neighbors, one of the quotes from your book that I really liked, I've added it to chat. You are my neighbor. I commit to seeing your humanity first. Then I ask questions later. You are my neighbor, and I'm here to care for you in ways that are tangible and loud. Especially the part about listening first, asking questions later.
Yeah.
But those do kind of go hand in hand.
They really do. One of the things that is happening in my life right now is that I'm running for city council. And so this is, I know it's a big step, and it's taking a lot of my time in ways I really enjoy, but our election is the beginning of November. So we're in the thick of it right now. And this is just a municipal election. But we're in kind of that final stretch where we are spending a lot of time knocking on doors. And that is like, I am an introvert. So a lot of everything I'm writing about is from the lens of an introvert. I think we can tend to feel like if we're introverted, that kind of lets us off the hook for all of this. And so I'm here as the author of the book saying it really doesn't let us off the hook. We've got to work a little harder in some ways. But it's honestly like an introvert's nightmare to think of walking up to a stranger's door, knocking on it, interrupting them. And then on top of all those weird layers, you're also talking to them about politics. It seems like it would just be terrible. And I have to push myself every time I go out. Like, I got to gear up, and I got to, I'm always kind of hoping that it will rain. So I have a reason not to do it, but you put yourself out there and you get going, and it ends up being really meaningful in a lot of ways. And that quote that you just shared, David, reminds me of this whole process of what I've learned already in terms of not making assumptions about people and not making these snap judgments. And we're wired to do that. And I have to push against that within myself. But I just find myself surprised by people over and over and over again. I haven't had one negative encounter. Nobody has been terrible to me. even if they were very honest and saying like, I'm just never going to vote for you, that's not going to happen. They find ways to be gracious about it and to see my humanity, and I can see theirs in turn. And so it's been kind of affirming of the things I write about. You know, it's one thing to write about something or to read about something. It's another thing to actually embody that, to kind of put our bodies to that work in some way and just live it. So it's been fun.
Yeah. Well, my daughter's certainly introverted, and you introverts have a great way of seeing things that maybe go unnoticed by other people.
Mhm.
That's a great talent. I love it when she's along because she notices things I don't pick up on. So, Eric, you have a question.
Yeah, first of all, what a gift to be able to hear from you. I really appreciate your book, and um, yeah, I'd be curious if you'd be willing to, and I'm a fellow introvert, so this is all
Okay.
great.
High five.
Um, I'd be curious about, because you also, I mean, your book, I mean, there's neighboring and there's those that you, and I love the way you put that, right? Learning to be neighbors together. But there's an element of your book that explores sort of systemic issues, right?
Mhm.
So the young man, you know, what he was dealing with, incarceration, et cetera, and coming out from that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just, what's the interplay between that, you know, neighboring, which can stay polite and cordial and whatever,
Yeah.
and this really hard stuff that sometimes
Yeah.
happens, interrupts, you know, they
Yeah.
can't interrupt that. I don't know. I don't care to share about that.
I totally appreciate that question. When I set out to write this book, and you know, I talked to a lot of different publishers about it, and I hadn't even started writing the book yet, but I knew if I, at that point, I guess it, you know, we would have been here 10 or 11 years. And I knew that if I had learned anything about living as neighbors and living in this neighborhood, it's that our neighbors form us. Our neighbors and our neighborhoods shape us, and they teach us and they change us. And I think that's all exactly as it should be. And so I knew that if I was going to do this justice, if I was going to be authentic in my writing about living as neighbors, there would be no escaping the fact that living in this place that's very complicated and complex and hard in some ways has really instilled in me the value of and the necessity of understanding systemic issues. If you would have told me 12 years ago that I was going to be running for local political office, I would not have believed you. If you would have told me the ways my personal politics have shifted, I would not have believed you. And all of those things came to form because I was seeing life from a bunch of different vantage points. Suddenly I was seeing, you know, I quote Hanif Abdurraqib, he's one of my favorite authors, and he talks about the eyes we have on the world. And suddenly I had a different, I could kind of put on a different pair of eyes onto the world. And what I was seeing, you know, as having a son, our oldest son, Robert, who is 29 years old now, but came into our family since we've been living here. He came into our family after being incarcerated and after serving time in prison, and, you know, moved in directly out of prison on home detention. He's a young Black man, and it changed me. And so then, you know, not long after that, my husband, Corey, ended up being the chaplain of the jail where Robert, our son, had been incarcerated. And so now, you know, that's what Corey does. And we live in a neighborhood where many people would land after kind of post-incarceration. And so most of the people in and through our lives have a history of incarceration, a history of substance abuse, a history of generational poverty, a history of systemic racism, on and on and on it goes. And so it became just absolutely inescapable for me to think about caring for the people around me without caring for the systemic issues that have impacted their lives. And it just was, it was sort of a non-negotiable for me, because I had to be, if I was going to write the book, I was going to write it in a way that was true and authentic to my experience. And my neighborhood specifically is primarily Latino, and learning from some of my neighbors in terms of, just immigration and, on it goes. It has just been impactful for me. And I came in at such a deficit. There was so much that I had never been taught. There was so much that I had not learned. There was so much that my life had not required me to even think about. And so here I was, in my mid-30s, trying to make up for lost time. And the good news is that work will be enduring forever. I want to be a lifelong learner. And the other good news is, wherever we happen to be, this can be our day one, that we say, oh, my curiosity has been piqued about something, or I've learned about something that I didn't know about before, and I want to learn more. And a Wi-Fi code or a library card or a Twitter or Facebook account or whatever can go a long way towards our learning. Listening to podcasts by people from different perspectives, reading authors from different perspectives. When I was kind of in that point of really wanting to learn, I set a personal goal for myself that I was not going to read. I'm a voracious reader. I read all the time. I read probably at the expense of sleep a lot of times. So I'm always reading. But I realized I was predominantly reading white authors and white women in a lot of ways. And so once again, it's like my eyes were open, like, oh, I've never even thought about this before, but now I've thought about it. And so what am I going to do about it? I just made the personal decision that for that next year, I was not going to read two white authors in a row. And of course, I am a white author, right? So I'm not here to say there's anything wrong with white authors, but I started to understand that I had the opportunity to broaden my scope, and it was on me to do that work. So that's kind of a long answer to your question, Eric, but I just appreciate it. I mean, I was talking on a podcast the end of last week, and she said, I just loved the footnotes in your book because I never knew, was it going to be something like ridiculous and funny, or was it going to be something really meaty and like, hey, go learn about redlining. Here's a link. Or let's think about the words we use to talk about people from marginalized spaces. Here's a place where you can learn more about that. And so it's a real mixed bag down there in the footnotes, but that was one more tool that I used to just kind of further that conversation, because we're all coming into this from different points. We're all going to be beginning in different places and continuing in different places. But for people, I hope the goal would be that, anybody who kind of catches the fire with this would then say, okay, now I need to be reading other people's perspectives about neighboring, about politics, about community from a different perspective than Shannan had, and continuing to take that deeper.
Others, we have probably time for another question from someone else. There's a few of you on here. I see you always have questions.
You can ask me anything, and that's the truth.
Don't be shy, jump on in. Or I'm going to call you out.
I'll ask one.
All right, Patty.
So is there any one thing that sparked you to look at things differently when you moved into your new neighborhood, like a different point of view?
I don't know that there was one thing in particular. It was just kind of waking up bit by bit to a lot of different things. And so I don't know if I remember. I mean, I would say that first and foremost, we moved into a neighborhood where some of our next door neighbors, we had a language barrier with them. That was not something I had ever experienced before. And that made it feel like it might be a little challenging. And they're still our neighbors, and they're beloved neighbors. And the language barrier has kind of diminished a little bit over time. But we just watched our kids just get to work. Like their kids and our kids, they just didn't care. They couldn't really understand each other, and they just didn't care. They just ran out into the yard and started playing together. And to me, that was just another illustration of like, we don't have to let these things hold us back. And, you know, for the adult version of running out to jump on the trampoline together, I don't know for sure what that is, but for us, it looks like, you know, we started just spending every 4th of July together with kind of that potluck style. Like, you bring food, we'll bring food. Food goes a really long way towards connecting people. And so then it turned into, you know, we're 12 years in now. And so they bring us tamales on Christmas Eve, and we bring them cinnamon rolls on Christmas morning. And like, we have kind of some of these rhythms and routines that have kind of helped pave the way. One of my favorite, you know, I talked a moment ago about how I've learned so much from my neighbors. One of my favorite moments, and it was really impactful, and it happened early on. Those particular neighbors invited us to their daughter's birthday party. And it was in the wintertime. You know, we were in their basement in their home, and we were the only people there who did not speak Spanish. My 18-year-old son is now pretty fluent in Spanish all these years later. So that's pretty fun to see. But at the time, we were very aware of, like, you know, we're going to eat food and be happy to be here, but we don't really understand what's being said around us. And at some point I realized, you know, you kind of notice, like, wait, I feel like they might be talking about me, and just waiting to see what happened next. And what was happening was they were bringing out the birthday cake for their daughter, and they were talking amongst themselves and decided to sing happy birthday in English so that
Aw.
we could sing with them for their daughter's birthday. And that was just profoundly meaningful to me. You know, that was something that they certainly did not have to do. We had no expectation of that. That's not even the song that they would have really sung. And they sang their other songs after, but they made the decision with us right there in the room that they were going to celebrate in a way that we could take part in. And that is a lesson on living as neighbors. And that is something, you know, those little moments that just happen in the middle of regular life that have really trained me to be thinking more about the other person, to kind of try to see life from their perspective. And it continues to change me.
That is a really sweet story, a sweet example.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
as we prepare to wrap up, I think one of the best things about Amazon, which is where your book, Start with Hello, is available, among other places, but easy to find on Amazon, are some of the reviews that people give on a book and what they take away from it. And one of the reviews, pardon me, under your book was titled Small Steps, Big Change. And this person wrote, love your neighbor. We all know that's what we're supposed to do. It's even what I want to do. However, there are so many roadblocks, real or imaginary, that keep me stuck in my own world. Start with Hello shows you how one word or even a wave can put you on a path to knowing and loving your neighbor well. This is music to this anxious introvert's ears. And while she says to start with hello, this is not where we stop. Through storytelling and her actual life, Shannan invites us to take it 1, 2, or 10 steps further. I just thought that was a great way to sum up the book, and a great way to wrap up today. Even start with hello is the first step, but it's not the last step.
Yep.
And we sure appreciate the encouragement you've given us to take those steps and the example you give in your book.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, it's worth getting a hold of and worth taking a read. Well, anything else in summary from anyone?
Just thank you for being on today. We appreciate you.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, it's great to. Shan and I have visited before. I've certainly appreciated the connection and the book, and being a cheerleader for her and her efforts. And we are all in this together, right?
That's the thing. I want to thank every one of you for being a person who cares about this. You know, I've talked to David and Jennifer about this. There's this feeling I have that if I know somebody else is even a little bit interested in this idea, it's like an instant kinship and connection. So thank you for being people who care, because I think we can change the world. I really, really do.
small incremental changes over a long
Yep.
period of time lead to a big change. So that's the goal. We have a friend in Florida that several of us know, Tim, to tell us, that says when anyone's talking about neighboring, we all benefit. So we all love this idea and
Mhm.
support it. And it's good to encourage each other and good to gather together to hear from people like Shannan. We really appreciate your effort in this field.
Thanks.
Yes, we
All right.
do.
All right. Well, everybody, thank you. Have a great day. Thanks for being part of this bonus edition of Neighboring 101.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Have a wonderful, blessed day, everybody.